KGI and meet the people that the institution is all about, because it is all about you. And I became acquainted with KGI through a meeting that I gave on one of the meeting I was at on one of the committees, where we were discussing biotech and training of people for biotech, what was going on in the United States and training new scientists. And one of the models that was discussed was KGI, which is a really interesting way is tell you a little bit about my own journey, because back in those days, well, I can just say that when I began graduate school at MIT, it was considered a failure if you wanted to go into business. Nobody serious about science went into business, and that was sort of the universal attitude of all professors. By the time I graduated from MIT, every single one of them was associated with, had founded, or was consulting for either big pharma or a biotech company. So things changed very rapidly in those 4.5 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own journey through there. I'm going to start by talking about the various phases of my own career, which is rather erratic. And then I'm going to talk specifically about one of the boards that I'm on, which is the Massachusetts Life Science Center, and some of the lessons that it has in terms of thinking strategically about how biotech in a region can be strengthened. And there's some interesting facts about where in the United States the most biotech jobs are, which may be of some interest to you. So as I told you, I began as a graduate student at MIT quite a while ago. And when I went to MIT, I wanted to be a developmental biologist. I had become interested in science at a very early age, probably because I mistakenly thought that scientists got to work all day in a quiet room by themselves. Now, this may be because I'm the eldest of 6 kids. I have over 100 first cousins. Currently, I have 17 nieces and nephews, 19 grandnieces and nephews, and I still have all those cousins. So a room of your own, a lab of your own, is very attractive. Of course, that's not at all how science is done, as I learned, but nevertheless, that interest in science stayed with me. And I really wanted to do developmental biology because, of course, one of the pressing questions then and now is how is it that you can go from that single egg to a complete functioning organisms that we are all here today and we're surrounded by in our world. Now, we're a lot closer to understanding that process now than we were then, but that was really the key question. And I became interested in it because John Gurdon, who was the person to show that you could take a nucleus from a frog skin, put it into an anucleated frog egg and make a whole frog, that when he came to talk to us, that was pretty exciting. But when I got to MIT, there wasn't anybody doing molecular biology that I wanted to work with. Now, I went to MIT for an interesting reason. I was an undergraduate starting at the University of Washington in Seattle. I went there from New Mexico, where I grew up, probably because I felt that if I didn't leave New Mexico, then I was never going to leave New Mexico. And I think that's generally a good thing. When you're going to school, it's a good time to get away and try new things. Nothing needs to be forever, and it's always good to try to get outside your comfort zone. So for me, it was the University of Washington. And then I met a guy there, as so often happens. He was a medical student, and it was clear that he was either going to go to Vietnam or he was going to go to Bethesda, to the National Institutes of Health. And so he went to the National Institutes of Health. They got to him before the Army did. And so it was clear that he was going to be there, and if anything was going to happen, one of us had to move, and guess who that was going to be? So I couldn't go to Johns Hopkins, which was my first choice, because Johns Hopkins was an all-male school at the time. They did not admit women to the undergraduate program. This was a long time ago. So I went to Goucher College, which was a small women's college in Towson, pretty close to Bethesda, and became a student there. And as a result of being there, I got a job at NIH for the summer, which was terrific. I did research in the laboratory of Loretta Levy, who was going to be my reference for graduate schools. Now, I knew I had to go to a graduate school in Boston because that's where Tony was going to go for his residency. We were an item by then, as you might have gathered, still are, 47 years later. So I applied to Boston University and Tufts and several programs at Harvard, at Brandeis, basically every place, but I did not apply initially to MIT. And so Loretta, my mentor, said, why haven't you applied to MIT? And I said, I can't go to MIT. I'm not good at math. And there's all those guys running around with slide rules. What do I do at MIT? So she said, and this is one of the first lessons I learned, if you're serious about molecular biology, and you have told me that's what you want to do, you have to apply to MIT. They have the best program in the country. And so I said, okay, I'll apply already. So I applied. And it was a good thing that I did because MIT was the only school in the area that admitted me. So as a result of that, I got admitted to what I consider still graduate student heaven. At MIT in the Department of Biology, we were students, but much like here, we were junior colleagues more than that. It was true that we didn't know as much as our mentors and teachers, but we were partners with them in this enterprise called science. We would have lunch together in the, quote, faculty dining room and talk about stuff. Not always just science. Salvador Luria, who was the graduate officer and the Nobel laureate, used to have a session on poetry because he believed very firmly that a complete person did things beyond their primary interests. So at MIT, we had a relatively small graduate class. There were 12 of us. And so we sat down one day and divided up the faculty. In many graduate schools, students compete to see which lab they're going to get into. We decided not to do that. We divided the faculty up first, hashed out if we had common desires. So I went to go see David Baltimore. He was a bright young thing at that time. He had just discovered reverse transcriptase, the enzyme which copies RNA into DNA. And we all knew that he was in line for a Nobel Prize. We just didn't know when. I went to go see David and said, I'd like to work in your lab. And he says, I don't have any room. I'm all filled up. So I said, okay. And then I went next door to Harvey Lodish's office. They shared a secretary and an office and talked to Harvey about doing a project in his lab. And we cooked up a project where we take poliovirus, which was one of David's experimental viruses, and try to figure out how it was translated. So then I went back to David and said, I could be a joint student and I'd be really in Harvey's part of the space. And he said yes. Oh. And so I became the first graduate student at MIT to have 2 graduate advisors. They both signed my thesis. I learned there another lesson when I got ready to be a postdoc. I arranged that myself. I figured, okay, now I can go do developmental biology. And I was entranced by Fotis Kafatos and his work. Fotis was studying the silk moth, the wild silk moth, the American silk moth. Its eggs come in a string. So it's a developmental time course from the very earliest stage of egg development to its most mature. And as it matures, it develops this very beautiful and elaborate proteinaceous shell. So we figured that would be a good model for studying developmental biology and gene control. And it would have been, except that turns out Polyphemus has a very big genome. And this shell turned out to have more than 100 different proteins, all of them the same size. All of the RNAs were the same size. It was a very frustrating mess. Sort of at the beginning of this, Arch Efstratiadis was my lab mate in class. He was a crazy Greek. He had an MD from Greece. He had also been a Shakespearean actor. And we shared a laboratory, and, he's Greek, I'm Mexican-American, we yelled a lot. Mostly about trivial things like the concentration of a formaldehyde gel, or, where the pipettes should go in the lab, and stuff like that. But he was a superb guy, scientist. He had an MD, but he decided it wasn't sufficient, so he was in the graduate program and was, in fact, a graduate student at the time that I was postdoc. Well, he got together with Tamaniadis, and they showed that you could use reverse transcriptase to copy RNA into double-stranded DNA, and then that could be cloned. That was the era in which we first realized that you could take a piece of DNA from one organism, hook it to another organism, amplify it, and then you had huge amounts of DNA that you could look at its structure in exquisite detail. So it was a really exciting time. Large was doing that upstairs while I was playing with Polyphemus downstairs. So I went off that was also the time where in Cambridge, recombinant DNA was banned because people thought it might be dangerous. It's a little analogous now to the fuss that there is going on about genetically modified organisms. If you take a fish gene and put it into a tomato so the tomato no longer freezes, is that potentially dangerous? And people don't like their foods mucked around with, or that's the attitude both here and in Europe. Well, of course, there aren't any foods that aren't genetically mucked around with. We've been interbreeding these animals and plants for a very long time, and there's this, it's not just a misunderstanding, because some people who really do understand the biology still are uncomfortable by this business of mixing things like that. So it was then, and there was a very strong feeling against this recombinant DNA, and so we were banned in Boston and Cambridge. So I went to Cold Spring Harbor for a year to try to clone Polyphemus. We figured, well, we can make copies of the RNA and we can get our proteins that way. Only we were trying to clone it in a really debilitated bacteria in a ridiculously inefficient plasmid, and with a genome the size of Polyphemus, that was never going to work. I like to think that it inspired Tom Maniatis to come up with packaging in phages, which he subsequently did, and of course, he was off and running. When I came back from that really awful year at Cold Spring Harbor, ARG came to me because I came with a truckload of restriction enzymes. Now, back in that day, New England Biolabs was only a gleam in Rich Roberts' eye. What it consisted of was a freezer at Cold Spring Laboratory, which had every enzyme that he had found. When you went to Cold Spring Harbor, the first thing you had to do was make an enzyme and characterize it. Mine was bagels 1 and 2. I was the first person to isolate and separate those two enzymes. It was routine. We didn't publish it, you just did it. You added to the collection in the freezer, and in exchange, you got access to all those restriction enzymes, which made it a really treasure trove. So I got a little bit of all those enzymes when I went back to Harvard, and a little bit of an enzyme called terminal transferase, which at the time people were having difficulty isolating because they were all trying to isolate it from fat cows, fat American cows, and terminal transferase binds to fat and you lose it there. So that meant when I got back, I knew how to clone, and I had these enzymes. So Arch came to me and said, Wally and I, meaning Wally Gilbert, have been working on a project to try to clone the insulin cDNA, and we need somebody to clone. Will you do it? And I said, well, all right, but we'll do all the controls, and I get to call the shots on this part of the project, and I have to look for a job. And he said, fine. Or actually said, fine. So we did it, and it was a very exciting time, because in 6 months, we did clone the cDNA and showed that you could express insulin in bacteria. Now, put your mind back then. At the time, although we knew that the genetic code was the same in bacteria and in eukaryotes, there was no guarantee. We knew that codons were used differently. The amino acids used slightly different codons for the genetic code. There were several possibilities. Codon usage would be so different you couldn't get a eukaryotic protein in a bacterium. A eukaryotic protein might be recognized as different and proteolyzed instantly. There's lots of proteolysis going on. Maybe the RNA wouldn't be stable. There are all kinds of reasons to believe this wouldn't work, but it did. And it worked for us very nicely. And so we published that paper, and that really made it possible for me to go on and do just about everything else I've done in my career. I did get a job. I went to UMass Medical School. I set up a laboratory. I started training people. I did a classic mistake, which is the same in both academia and business. And you should all listen to this, is I did not know when or how to say no. So, being a woman and a minority, I was a member of just about every committee in the university. I was on more committees than anyone else, except for my black colleague. I developed more courses and so on and so forth. And what that meant, of course, since one has limited energy, is that I was not paying attention to the work in the laboratory, and I did not publish as extensively as I should have. And so when it came time for tenure, it was not a slam dunk, to put it mildly. Fortunately, Susan Lehman, the woman who found substance P, isolated substance P, was on my thesis committee, and she was terrific. She pulled me off the ceiling more than once. She always had a lot of Kleenex in the office. It was very helpful, and she helped run this through, so in the end, I did get tenure. However, having gone through that, it's a debilitating academic experience, even if you're in good shape. And if you're not in good shape, it's really devastating. So I said, okay, if this is going to be so hard, I'm going to go back and play with big boys, and I accepted a non-tenured position at Harvard at the Children's Hospital in the Division of Neuroscience. And I was there for 8 years. We published a lot of papers, and that's where we did things like we provided Bruce Yankner, who's now a full professor at Harvard in the neurology department. We provided the first evidence that amyloid is toxic to neural cells. We did some work with cell biology showing how insulin and pro-insulin are processed as they go through the cells. We did some evolutionary work with the rat insulins versus human insulin and how the two insulins in rats and mice aren't exactly the same. They seem to be, one of them, the RNA is not as stable, so you don't make as much protein. And so we've dabbled in cell biology, neurology, and really had a very good time for about 8 years. Then I decided perhaps it was time to do something different. So I began asking around. This is a good thing to do. If you're trying to make a change in your life, it turns out that it pays to talk to people. You really saying something out loud to another person and getting that feedback, or even just that sympathetic listening ear, can be very useful in helping you to find your path. So I talked to a lot of people, and I really kind of thought I would drop all of the extraneous stuff that I was doing and go back to the lab full time and maybe focus on 1 or 2 topics there instead of having a wide open scenario, which was no longer viable in the grants world. But to my surprise, several people pointed out that I was actually pretty good at the administrative thing, and maybe I should consider that. As a result of one of these conversations with Alice Wong, who was David Baltimore's wife and who had left the laboratory to become a dean when he took a presidency in New York at Rockefeller University, she had talked to me about this, how the change had been for her and what it might be like and so forth. So she told a headhunter who called her up about a job, and she called me, the headhunter, and said, you know, there's a job in Chicago you might be interested in, you should look at it. And I said, Chicago? Why would I want to go to Chicago? All I knew about Chicago was O'Hare Airport, mind you, which of course is not a great part of Chicago. So the headhunter told me something which has stuck with me, which is, you don't have to take this job, but you have told me that you are interested in this kind of a job. And if that's the case, you have to look at this job. So what could I do? I went to Northwestern to look at the job, which was assistant vice president for research. And there, 2 things happened. One is Northwestern is a wonderful campus and a wonderful part of the world. It's an exciting university, and I really hit it off with who would be my boss, Bill Kern, who was a theoretical chemist and the vice president for research. And he turned out to be one of my great mentors. He taught me a lot about administrative work and how you handle things. From little things, like there's always a clock where you can see it, so you don't have to look at your watch, but you can stay on time. How he resolved disputes among the faculty. He once had 2 physicists in his office who couldn't agree about something, so he kept in his office a dartboard, and he said, I'm going to throw darts. And if it hits the 10, it's going to be yes, and if it hits anywhere else, it's going to be no. So if you guys can't decide, that will decide it for you. Okay? And they decided. So he was great. And he was clearly looking for his successor. One of the things you will learn, if you haven't already, is that when you enter a position of leadership, one of the first things you should worry about is who could take over if you were hit by a bus. That might not be the person who ultimately takes over, but it does mean that your work can continue in the event that something happens, and things happen. So he was clearly looking for his successor, and 2 years later, after a national search, I indeed became the vice president for research at Northwestern, and it was a great job. It was also a job which continued my interest in business. Now, when I was in Wally's lab and we were cloning insulin, what he was doing was founding Biogen. And so I saw Biogen grow from 3 of us in his laboratory to, you know, what it is today. And saw Wally in that role from the founding board of advisors to board member to CEO to dismissed CEO. And so I got to see the company up close. When I left my postdoc, Wally asked if I wouldn't want to consider a job at Biogen, which was then a laboratory in Boston, in Cambridge, and one in Geneva. It had two sites at the time. And, you know, I'd worked for David Baltimore, who was a Nobel laureate when I was a graduate student. I'd worked for Wally Gilbert as a postdoc. I really wanted to know what I could do by myself, so I said, no, thank you. Thank you, but no thank you. But Wally did a good thing for me. What he did was he made me an advisor to Biogen. And that meant I got to go to all of the annual meetings where the board was held. So my first board experience really happened as a very young assistant professor, where I would go and all parts of the board that were not closed, that were not executive session, I got to sit in on. And I want to tell you, that was a great education as Biogen went through its early growing pains. And Wally Gilbert, I mean, for all of you, for many of you sitting in this room, as you look around for who will be your mentors as you go through your academic and business careers, there aren't many of us in the fields that we represent who necessarily look like us, who understand our own backgrounds. At the time I graduated from MIT as a PhD, I think I was number 5 Mexican-American woman to get a PhD in the hard sciences. So most of my mentors were white men, and the ones who weren't white men were white women, until, you know, I was already pretty far along and discovered some of my colleagues. So it's the same is true for you, even though it's many, many years later. And a good mentor is not necessarily someone who will hold your hand and, you know, tell you everything's going to be all right. Very frequently, the best mentor will give you a good kick in the pants when you need it. And Wally was certainly not known as a softie. He was demanding. He required he had very high standards, but he had the same standards for all of us. And this was something that I didn't really understand until very recently, that comfort level with him. I didn't mind being bawled out with Wally because he was bawling me out because he knew that I was capable of something and he wanted me to get there. There were other major scientists in the field that I interacted with that I felt not comfortable around. And I realized, you know, like 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half, that many of those people were looking at me and they were seeing a woman in a minority and they were making assumptions about my capabilities. So they weren't assuming that I was capable of certain things. They were rather expecting that I was not. And that's a very interesting subject. And if you haven't read it, you should read the book called Whistling Vivaldi. It's about a thing called Stereotype Threat. When if you are someone who is in a situation that you're not usually, like a woman in mathematics, then you might worry about your performance. And that worry will get in the way of your performance. And it will take away energy from your doing the task at hand. And so Whistling Vivaldi is how you do that. It's Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. He was the provost at Berkeley for a while. He's a social scientist and a very good experimenter. There's a lot of good science going on in psychology that we could all benefit from. That's how I'm spending my time these days, by the way. So I learned, I was very fortunate because my mentors, David Baltimore, Harvey Lodish, Wally Gilbert, Bill Kern, all white men, were all nevertheless white men who fully believed that women and other people, they accepted you into their laboratory because they believed that you had the capability of doing something, and then they pushed and they pulled and they demanded until you did the best that you could do. So that's a thing to look for in your mentors and helpers. Well, the other thing that happened at Northwestern was that Don Jacobs, who was the dean of the business school at Kellogg for many, many years, and his successor, Deepak Jain, called me one day and asked for an appointment. Well, when the dean calls the vice president for research, it usually means that the dean wants something, usually money. The business school at Kellogg at Northwestern did not need money from the central administration. They were a very wealthy school. In fact, they had built their new building on a site that used to be occupied by the School of Education. They simply bought out the school and built them a new building somewhere else so that they could have the waterfront. So I knew they didn't want money from me, but they wanted something. So we went to breakfast, and that's always very pleasant at Kellogg. It's a beautiful facility on the lake, and so we had this wonderful breakfast, and we were talking, and I put up this flyer. Is that what you want? Title for somebody? No, that wasn't it. Threw up another little hint. No, that wasn't it. It turned out they wanted me to take the 1 month, 24/7 business school in a box that's offered for rising executives throughout the world. And so for the cost of my books, I took that course. And that was extraordinarily helpful for me because it provided me with many of the tools that you're getting here in dealing with business issues, finance, and how to read a spreadsheet, and HR issues, and strategy, and leadership, and all of that was in this very, very concentrated 1 month thing where we worked 24/7 in teams. Well, that turned out to be good because all this time that I was having a wonderful time at Northwestern, for 7 years I was there, Tony and I were commuting because he's a professor at Harvard Medical School. He's very happy there. There's no way on earth he's ever going to leave. He's now professor emeritus, but nevertheless, getting him out of Boston is not something that's going to happen easily. So we commuted. And the reason we decided to commute was because we were discussing whether or not I should consider this job seriously one weekend at his sister's house in Long Island. And she pointed out rather astringently that we would probably see each other more if I took the job, because then we always were traveling without each other, so maybe we'd make plans to travel to see each other. And we thought, oh, you have a point there. So we made a plan. Every other weekend we would get together in Chicago or someplace else. It turned out to be less frequently Boston than Chicago or someplace else. And during that weekend we would play. No work. That had never happened in our marriage. And actually when I went back to Boston, it stopped happening. Except for, occasionally now that we're both semi-retired, we just spent, for example, 3 weeks visiting national parks. That was great. That worked very well for us, but 7 years is a long time, so I went back to Boston. And I took a job as the vice president for research at the Whitehead, which was something that David Baltimore had founded. And I had 3 great years there with Susan Lindquist, who was the director, the first woman and the first non-Whitehead founder to be director. And Maxine Singer was the chairman of the board. It was an irresistible chance to work with these folks. And for 3 years, we had some fun doing that. And that was the time at which the Genome Center at the Whitehead Institute became the Broad Institute as an independent entity. And it was my job to make that happen. So one day, 200 people went to sleep as Whitehead employees. And the next day, they all woke up as Broad Institute employees. And I want to tell you that the work that goes into that is substantial. But then after that, the other thing that happened then was I got on another board, which was Transkaryotic Therapies. Transkaryotic Therapies was a publicly traded company. The CEO was Michael Astrup. He had been a young lawyer at Biogen at the time that I'd been an advisor, so he invited me to the board. I kind of think Wally Gilbert had something to do with that because he was already on the board of TKT. So there I was, the only woman, certainly the least business experience. The chairman of the board was a guy who had been CEO of Merck. Everyone else had extensive experience. There were 5 of us, or maybe 7. And TKT was doing great. It was developing medicines. The stock was rising. The employees were happy. It was on its way to being an independent company. And then Shire Pharmaceuticals said, we'd like to buy you. And Michael Astrup went berserk. He did not want to sell the company. He brought it back from the brink. He accused the chairman of the board, who was from Merck, as having engineered this because the new CEO at Shire had been this guy's mentee at Merck. They had worked together. As it turns out, that's probably not the case. But nevertheless, the chairman of the board and the CEO must be hand in glove in working together. It just doesn't work if they're not. And so it was apparent there had to be a new chairman of the board, especially if we were going to consider this offer. And so we had a meeting one January to discuss who it would be. And we always thought, the way things work on a board is a lot happens in telephone calls between board meetings. The board is just to check it off. And so several of us had had many phone calls and discussions, and it was pretty clear to at least that set of us that Wally Gilbert was the most experienced person for that job, and he should be chair of the board. Well, we went into this board meeting, and there was another set of trustees, about a few people who didn't want Wally to be chair because they felt Wally was too much in favor of selling the company to Shire. So this meeting, which was supposed to be an hour and a half or so, lasted 8 hours. And at the end of the 8 hours, I walked out as chair of the board of transcardiac therapies. Yeah. And I think it was for two reasons. One was I was fairly neutral. I hadn't expressed an opinion. The other reason, I think, is that all the guys thought that they could probably influence me to their mode of thinking. And so it was a safe choice from both perspectives. So I immediately called Don Jacobs at Kellogg and said, I've just become chairman of the board. What do I do? And I explained to him the situation with Shire and TKT. And he said, well, first of all, remember, bankers make their money when the company is sold, because the way things are done now, their compensation is tied to a successful sale. They get more money if the company is sold than if it's not. And the same is true of mergers and acquisition lawyers. So get yourself a lawyer whose fee is flat, doesn't depend on the outcome of the transaction, and try to get a banker. He knew how hard it would be to get a banker. It turned out to be very hard to get a banker. We didn't get an independent banker till the very last minute. We, of course, had a banker whose compensation was dependent on the outcome and who'd been our banker for some time. And we found everybody could agree on the law firm. Crothers in New York is considered the best mergers and acquisition firm. And there was someone that everybody liked. She was a woman who had negotiated the Time Warner merger, among other things. So I called her up on a Saturday. We negotiated a breathtaking, even to this day, fee for the transaction, and plus expenses, of course. And on Sunday, she was in Boston. And there we went for 6 months. Trying to get a good process in place, because the way the world works, the role of the board in such a transaction is that you're supposed to get the best value for your shareholders. Well, as all of this interest in the meantime, Mike Astrew was talking to the newspaper about how terrible everything was and how awful Shire was and how they were going to destroy the company if they bought it, and the board was not doing what he wanted, and so forth. And so it was complicated. And so we really had to have something that would stand up. Well, during that time, Carl Icahn came in, about 10% of the company at the height of the stock value, and then subsequently sued when we sold the company for that offer, because he felt we hadn't gotten the best value. And a couple of other of the big shareholders are also sued, so we all spent the next several months doing depositions. There's nothing like being in deposition with you and 12 lawyers. But I happen to like depositions. I had done them before because I'd been an expert witness in a number of cases, usually as an explainer, to try to explain how different life was when you had to make all your own enzymes and so forth versus the kit world. And a deposition is kind of like a really intense tennis game, you know? You just want to keep the ball going, and every now and then you like to have a good overhead smash. So I don't get bothered in depositions, and this is useful if you're in a situation like that. And so ultimately we won the case. It was the charges were dismissed, and Carl Icahn had to settle for the amount that he bought the company, which was at a loss. Too bad. So that was also very useful. It teaches you a lot about managing people. My skill was not the business. These guys all knew more business than I did, but I was perfectly free to ask them what they knew. What I could do was get everybody talk to me. I was willing to call people to get information that I needed about those things that I didn't know. And I'm reasonably good on my feet these days, so I could talk about the issues to the folks that were there, and so it turned out to be in good stead. So that led to a job with the company, Cytonome, because Wally watched all this and was also an advisor. And after it was all over, he said, you know, my son John has formed a company, Cytonome, and I think he could use your help with the board. Why don't you talk to him? So I went to talk to John, and it was clear that John didn't need my help with the board. He needed my help within the company. John, like many entrepreneurs, was a brilliant guy. His concept was a cell sorter that would be sterile and fast so that you could use it for therapeutic purposes. That was, he set this up in 20 years ago now. He had the idea, and he had the basic IP for a microfluidic thing so you could have the fluidics separate from the optics. For those of you who might not know, or in most cell sorters, the optics, you drop your drop through air and a laser comes through, hits the cell that's been labeled with fluorescent antibodies or something, and the computer reads those signals, and then you can sort your cells that way. So what John did was to invent a way of doing this in an enclosed chip so that it was possible to sort cells sterilely. And he then parallelized it so it was possible to do it fast. And then he went out to try to find money, and he did find money from an angel. And then he got me involved. But he turned out to have a problem, which many founders have, which is he couldn't let anyone else do their job. He thought he knew it all. So he hired very good people, engineers primarily, because putting this together turned out to be a very challenging task. And he wasn't letting them do it, and he wasn't listening to his board, who in fact were quite knowledgeable people. So he and I agreed to switch places. I became the CEO. He became Chief Technical Officer, which was his strength, except he didn't let his engineers do the work either. He was always second guessing them. So ultimately, he left the company. Well, by this time, Wally Gilbert was on the board, because that was a condition of my becoming CEO. It's challenging when you want to fire a guy whose father is on your board of directors. But Wally has this unique ability to separate himself, the emotions and the situation. He sees things very clearly. So he knew John's weaknesses, and he knew he had to go. He wasn't real happy with the way it played out, I'll tell you that. But nevertheless, he was very supportive. He stayed on the board until very recently when he resigned over another issue. So I became CEO, and I went out looking for money in 2007, just about the time that the crash came. Now, that's very difficult because with a company, as you know, you can't run out of money, and you can't run out of money, and you can't run out of money. So three of us, me, Wally Gilbert, and our angel, Alan Dorsky, kept the company going for 3 years. And then we found a partner whose business was sorting sperm to make milk cows, sorting sperm into males, sperm and female sperm, so that you only get cows, because you don't really want bulls for two reasons. They're a waste biologically because they don't do milk, and they carry the genetics, so they don't want them out there. It dilutes your position in the market. And so this guy, who is Colombian, out of Texas A&M, founded a company to sort cells by brute force using used cell sorters that he bought wherever he could get them. He liked our technology, so he agreed to invest in the company on the agreement that he got to keep all of the technology for sperm sorting. And so he has. Now the company, I've retired now from management. The company is making Genesis, which is the sperm sorter. We have that in 100 laboratories throughout the world. The Thermo Fisher, we've signed an agreement with them. They are going to market, assuming we finish it, a benchtop cell sorter. It fits in a BioHood so that you can, and it's meant to be very easy to use. We want to democratize cell sorting in the way that PCR machines democratize PCR. And then finally, our dream machine, the cell sorter for cell therapy, we have an agreement with another pharmaceutical company, and if that works out, then that machine may actually finally see the light of day. So we'll see. And so now I'm on the board. There are management issues, there always are in any organization that has more than 3 people. And so that's an interesting place to be. And I'm on the board of ATCC, which is a company that sells reagents and is a repository for cells. If you buy a HeLa cell from ATCC, it will be a HeLa cell and not a CHO cell or anything else. They also sell primary cells, and they're developing embryonal stem cells and so forth, pluripotent stem cells and so forth. So it's an interesting company because it was founded by Congress. It's a not-for-profit. And so it has unique problems, and I'm on the executive committee of that board. And I'm on a number of committees, many of which have to do with trying to increase the numbers of underrepresented groups, which include women and Hispanics and Blacks in science, because there aren't enough of us there. And trying to understand why that has been the case in this country for the last forever. And it turns out that part of the reason is that human beings' minds have developed in a way that we tend to make gut decisions without thinking about them. And that can get in our way of rationally evaluating someone else's qualities. And so these days I run around giving talks on that, and we can talk about it more if I leave you time for questions. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about the Mass Life Science Center. It's one of the boards I'm on. It was a gubernatorial appointment. This was put together by the previous governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, who decided that it would be a good idea. Massachusetts, like California, is one of the centers of the biotechnology enterprise. It did not have at the time a large representation of big pharma. Although big pharma was, nosing around all the time, they didn't have a physical presence there, except for a few. Pfizer was one. So Deval Patrick thought, with the help of a few of the leaders in biotech and the industry, said, we ought to do something to be sure we maintain our position here. And so he got legislature to set aside or to pass a law that said we ought to spend $1 billion over 10 years to enhance biotech and big pharma in Massachusetts. And this involved the whole community in there, from the academics, Michael Porter, who's a renowned professor at Harvard Business School. There was a foundation in the city that provided money for a study, and then legislation passed it in 2007. And it was to encourage things broadly. Now, the best thing that this thing did, Deval Patrick did, was to hire Susan Wyndham-Bannister as its founding CEO, because she's a woman who can think strategically and broadly. And so much of what I'm going to tell you is a result of that first CEO. So she put together a board of people from all areas, all parts of the group, and some of it is defined in the legislation. I was on the board, for example, as the founder of a small biotech, CEO of a small biotech. She's the talent, she's the creative leader. We had a scientific advisory board who peer review all of the applications. And there's a huge group of VCs, academics, and entrepreneurs who serve on the scientific advisory board. And, they volunteer their time because they find it worthwhile. This is what the definition of the community, and its job creation and innovation is what we want to do. The interesting thing is that this does not focus on the big universities in Boston, Cambridge area, as you might expect, but is really a statewide thing, and it covers everything from K-12 through universities like Harvard and MIT, and from little companies of 2 to 10 people through the great big pharma thing. It's the concept of a whole ecosystem, and the concept that all of these things are necessary in order to have success. So these are the investments that have been made in collaboration, and that's collaboration between the academic world and the pharmaceutical world. The center acts as a convener. It brings together people interested in the same problem and says, you have something in common, you ought to be able to work this out. So that, for example, one of the things that the one collaboration is something called the Neuroscience Initiative, which brings together 10 big pharmaceutical groups, all interested in neuroscience, and the companies fund basic research in all of the academic institutions throughout this state in a competitive way, and they don't file divide IP at this stage. They just want to get some basic questions answered. Right now, their latest round, they're funding some work on Alzheimer's disease, and they will work out the IP issues when it gets to a point that there's something to develop. But they all agree that if they don't do this kind of support, there won't be anything to develop, especially given the granting thing. K through 12 programs involve things like Science Club for Girls, for example. It's an after-school program that started in Cambridge where kids K through 12 come and they do after-school activities, build rockets, learn about DNA and all that stuff. The rocket team, the Science Club for Girls is now 12 years old. The Rocket Club, junior high group, made it to the nationals last year. These are children who come from underprivileged families. It's really a pleasure to hear a mother talk about her 2 daughters who are so eager to get up on Saturday morning and go to Boston University to do science. And she looks wonderingly at the eye and says, my girls talk about how they're testing hypotheses. So it's a really cool thing. And what it cost there was $25,000 to help them with, I forget what. Internships. When this first came up, we asked, well, why do we need another internship program? There are 2,700 million internship programs in this state. What could we possibly bring that's new? What we could bring, it turned out, was a website where students who are in any Massachusetts institution or who are residents of Massachusetts but going to school elsewhere can put their resume up on a website that is done by the state, and their companies, and these are restricted to companies with under 50 employees, can go find the expertise that they need. This isn't just scientific expertise, but for example, Cytonome found a coder there, and we also found a regulatory person there, whom we later hired. And so this turns out to be really helpful. And many of these interns get jobs right as soon as they finish their internship in school, and so forth. As a result of at this point, it was in June that I last viewed these slides, we had invested about $500 million, and the return on that was $1.5 billion. So that became quite worthwhile.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things we learned was that in the biotech industry, the jobs that are available span the educational gamut. We needed to worry about people at every level of education because there were jobs for them at every level of education in the industry, and this was their breakdown. And this is where they are, so that you can see that the biggest chunk is bachelor's degrees, but there's something even without high school. There's a sizable fraction. And these are the states in the country with the most biotech jobs. Now, Massachusetts is down there at number 14 if you list by the number of jobs that are held in the life sciences. But if you look at the population of the state, we do very well relative to the state. As a result of this, every major pharmaceutical company in the world now has a physical presence in Boston, and many have moved their headquarters there. The latest being GE, which will have their GE Life Sciences section is totally in Massachusetts, and now the whole company has moved its headquarters from Connecticut to Boston. And Kendall Square is just chock-a-block with companies growing like crazy, even though rents there are unbelievably expensive. So mindful thinking, which is this, California actually did this first, but I think Massachusetts did it a little bit better because it was more general, and other states now are trying to mimic it. The lesson is that you never can count on staying number one. You have to work at it. And I'm going to stop because I've already talked too long. There is time for questions, including online, and we should let those people ask first because you can maybe stay up for minutes more.
We also have a room, we have the West Conference room set aside from 1 to 2 today, where Lydia will be, if you would also like to just come and have informal conversation as well.
And all questions are fair game. Question.
I just have a comment from Heather Petty. She's an alum. And she said she had the pleasure of meeting you last year, and that she appreciates your industry knowledge. So
that's nice. Thank you, Heather.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. So we're live streaming in case you wanted to.
Yes.
I know on the slides you mentioned that you have an interesting novel consortia participation. Can you expand on that? Kind of what function or what areas consortia operate in?
The consortium, in the mass life sciences, there are several consortia. One of the most interesting is really one that involves big pharma, like Merck and Genzyme, and name your big company, they're in it. There's 12 of them who have partnered with the big biotechs, who have partnered with the universities, MIT, Harvard, the Broad, and a number of others, to look specifically. One of them is neuroscience. There's another one that does. We bought a particle accelerator for the Dana-Farber, and the deal is that Dana-Farber can use this. What you do is you make short-lived isotopes for use in imaging for cancer and for brain studies. but it has to be available to the community being defined as the drug companies and small biotech who couldn't afford their own, 30% of the time. So there's that consortium, and it's not trivial to figure out a way to make these resources available to everybody in the community in a fair way. So they work at that. So but the major consortium is really big pharma talking as colleagues to the small biotechs, even the very small ones with 10 to 50 employees. And community colleges are in there too. Yes.
When you said that you first became the head of the board, and that you thought that maybe because they were some of the men were going to try and persuade you either way, what was the effect of that? Did you find that that really happened, and how did you deal with it?
They did, but you know, in many ways, that's not surprising because anytime you're in a leadership position, those whom you are leading will have opinions about what should be done, and they will be trying to sway you one way or another. I think the only thing that was unique about the situation at TKT was that there were so clearly two factions who wanted two very different outcomes. So the way that they did it was they would call me up and say, you know, really, if we sell this company, they're gonna fire all the employees, they're gonna sell off all the bits, it's gonna be very devastating, and all they'll do is make a little money. And our shareholders long term won't get as much. And the other side would say, you know, if we don't sell this company, it's not clear that we can go. It could be 20 years before we're really profitable. So there was a lot of that kind of suasion. And it was a remarkably, despite the intensity of the feeling, it was a remarkably collegial group. And so, I mean, I came in with scientific credentials which were impeccable. And I can be pretty stubborn myself. So it was always a conversation. I don't think anyone really tried any serious intimidation until we got to the courtroom stuff, which is a whole different thing. Yes.
What are some strategies that you have for dealing with people that are difficult?
What are some what?
Strategies that you have for dealing with people that are difficult?
Well, there's, I think, a couple. One of them I learned by accident, which is that I'm dense. I tend not to notice things until I'll say, you know, like later, or often years later, oh, that was kind of insulting, wasn't it? But it taught me a strategy, which is that nobody knows how you're feeling. They only know how you behave. So if you behave in a way that says that this hurtful behavior has not touched you, even if it has, then they think it hasn't. And that turns it back on them because they haven't had the desired effect. And so it turns out that on those occasions where somebody where I wasn't being so oblivious and actually noticed in the moment, that if I reacted as if though I hadn't noticed it, it was much more effective. On the other hand, sometimes it plays to turn it off with a joke. I was once on a boat with a guy who said something really insulting about gays and women. I think he said gays were gay because their mothers must have not been good mothers. They were probably working mothers, something to that effect.
Oh, God.
And so it was a while ago. So I looked at him and I said, Charlie, you are much too intelligent to believe that. And I laughed. Now, he never said anything like that to me again. And I don't know if it really changed his mind. He was an interesting character. But it called him on it in a way that didn't demean him in front of anybody else because there was a whole group of people there. So sometimes coming up with a joke. Now, sometimes you have to do that in advance. One of the useful things I did in my life was to work in theater. And that's very helpful because, as I say, nobody knows how you're feeling. They only know how you behave. And psychologically, it turns out that if you behave in a certain way, if you stand straight and walk tall and act proud in a situation, people think that you are confident and proud. If, on the other hand, you know, you're kind of defensive and you're all hunched over, you right away have set yourself up as a target. And so I actually spend some time, and I advise others to spend time looking at themselves in the mirror. How are you presenting yourself to the world? That's why it's helpful to play act when you're doing the practices for your presentations. That's why it's helpful to practice interviews. because you can get feedback from a friendly crowd before you're in front of that person who is in fact judging you. And as I say, they can't judge how you feel because they don't see that. They can only judge how you behave. So I said this at one talk I gave not too long ago, and it turned out that on Twitter, somebody said, Lydia via Komaroff just said, fake it till you make it. But yeah, basically, actually that works.